I recovered from surgery to discover they amputated the wrong limb. My doctor says I changed my mind before the operation. The phantom pain hit first. Not from the leg they'd removed, from the one that was still there. I woke up in the recovery room with my right leg throbbing, the kind of deep ache that comes from damaged tissue and severed nerves. Except my right leg was supposed to be fine. It was my left leg that had the tumor, the osteosarcoma that had been growing in my tibia for 8 months, the reason I'd scheduled the amputation in the first place. I tried to sit up, still foggy from anesthesia, and looked down at my body under the thin hospital blanket. My left leg was there, intact, whole. My right leg ended at the knee in a massive bandage, drainage tubes snaking out from beneath the gauze. They'd taken the wrong leg. They'd amputated my healthy leg and left the one with cancer still attached to my body. I'd been a high school history teacher in Portland for 11 years when I first noticed the pain in my left shin. Dull at first, easy to dismiss as overuse from coaching junior varsity basketball. But it got worse over months, sharper, keeping me awake at night. My wife Amanda finally convinced me to see a doctor when I started limping during classes. The orthopedic surgeon, Dr. William Brennan, 30 years in practice, ordered an MRI that showed the mass. Biopsy confirmed osteosarcoma, aggressive but caught early enough that amputation below the knee would give me the best chance of survival. Dr. Brennan was confident, reassuring, said he'd performed hundreds of these procedures. Amanda and I spent 3 weeks processing the news, grieving the loss of my leg, preparing for the physical and emotional adjustment. Our 2 kids, Austin, who was 14, and Lily, who was 12, took it hard, but rallied. We talked about prosthetics, about staying active, about how I'd still be able to teach and coach and be their dad. The surgery was scheduled for a Thursday in March at Riverside Medical Center. Standard procedure, Dr. Brennan said. I'd be walking with a prosthetic within 3 months. The pre-op process had been thorough. Multiple appointments, consent forms signed in triplicate, verification protocols. Dr. Brennan had used a surgical marker to draw an X on my left leg, the one that needed to come off. He'd done it in front of me and Amanda, asked me to confirm verbally which leg had the tumor, documented everything. The anesthesiologist, Dr. Helen Kowalski, 26 years in anesthesiology, had gone through my medical history, explained the process, assured me I'd wake up pain-free with the cancer gone. Amanda had kissed me before they wheeled me into the operating room, told me she'd be waiting when I woke up. I remembered counting backwards from 10 as the drugs took hold, remembered reaching 7, then nothing, until the recovery room and the impossible reality of the wrong leg, gone. A nurse noticed me sitting up, noticed my face. She came over quickly, professional smile already fading as she saw where I was looking. Her name tag read, Jennifer Oakes. I asked her why my right leg was bandaged, why my left leg was still there. She glanced at my chart, then at my legs, and her face went pale. She left without answering, moving fast but trying not to run. Came back 2 minutes later with Dr. Brennan. He looked exhausted, still in surgical scrubs, dark circles under his eyes. He pulled up a stool next to my bed and his expression was strange. Not panicked, not apologetic, almost defensive. He said we needed to talk about what had happened during the pre-op process that morning. According to Dr. Brennan, I'd changed my mind about which leg to amputate. He said that after receiving the pre-operative medication, after Amanda had left the prep area, I'd told him I wanted the right leg removed instead of the left. Said I'd been insistent, almost frantic, claiming I'd gotten confused about which leg had the tumor. He'd questioned me multiple times, he claimed, but I'd been adamant, so he'd called in the operating room supervisor, a woman named Patricia Donnelly, 32 years in surgical nursing, and together they'd documented my request to change the surgical site. They'd removed the X from my left leg, marked my right leg instead, and proceeded with the amputation I'd supposedly requested. I stared at him trying to process the words, trying to make them make sense in any reality I recognized. I told him I never said that, never requested a change. The tumor was in my left leg, everyone knew that. 8 months of appointments, scans, biopsies, consultations, all documenting the cancer in my left tibia. Why would I suddenly claim it was in the other leg? Dr. Brennan's voice stayed calm, but his jaw was tight. He said preoperative anxiety and medication could cause confusion, that patients sometimes experienced disorientation or false certainty about medical details. He said he had documentation of my request, signatures from multiple witnesses, that he'd followed proper protocol in responding to a patient's stated wishes. He'd acted in good faith based on what I'd told him. If I didn't remember the conversation, that was unfortunate, but it didn't change the fact that I'd made a clear verbal request witnessed by hospital staff. The implication was obvious. This was my fault. I'd confused my own legs, demanded the wrong amputation, and now had to live with the consequences of my drug-induced error. I felt my throat closing, hands shaking under the blanket. I asked to see the documentation. He said Amanda was in the consultation room and that he'd explain everything to both of us together. Amanda was crying before Dr. Brennan finished his second sentence. She kept shaking her head, saying it was impossible, that I'd never been confused about which leg had the tumor. We'd spent 3 weeks preparing for this surgery. We'd talked about it constantly. I'd been clear-headed and certain every single time. Dr. Brennan showed us the forms he claimed I'd signed that morning. My signature at the bottom of a document stating I was requesting the surgical site be changed from left leg to right leg. The handwriting looked like mine, but shaky, impaired. The kind of writing you'd have after they'd given you medication that altered your cognitive function. I had zero memory of signing that form. Zero memory of any conversation about changing the surgical site. The last thing I clearly remembered was Amanda kissing me goodbye. Everything after that was blank until I woke up with the wrong leg gone. Amanda demanded to know why Dr. Brennan had proceeded with a major surgical change based on a request made by a patient who was clearly impaired by medication. Why he hadn't called her back into the room to verify my wishes. Why he hadn't delayed the surgery to ensure I was making a rational decision. Dr. Brennan said that patients retained decision-making capacity even after receiving preoperative medication, that the drugs reduced anxiety but didn't eliminate competence. He'd assessed my mental state, determined I understood what I was requesting, and had proceeded accordingly. The law didn't require spousal approval for a patient's medical decisions. I'd been conscious, verbal, and insistent. He'd done his job. Amanda asked about the X he'd drawn on my left leg. The visual marker meant to prevent exactly this kind of error. Dr. Brennan said the X had been removed and replaced based on my request. Standard procedure when a patient changes their mind about surgical site. Patricia Donnelly backed him up, said she'd witnessed the entire interaction, that I'd been clear about wanting the right leg amputated instead of the left. We left the consultation room in shock. I was transferred to a regular hospital room for post-operative recovery. The next 3 days were a nightmare of pain medication, physical therapy assessments, and the growing realization that I was now an amputee with cancer still in my body. The tumor hadn't been removed. The surgery had accomplished nothing except taking a healthy limb. I'd need another operation to remove the left leg, the one that should have been amputated in the first place. Dr. Brennan recommended scheduling it for 2 weeks out, giving my body time to recover from the first surgery. I'd be a bilateral amputee, both legs gone below the knee. My life irrevocably altered because of what he claimed was my own confused request. Amanda started making phone calls from my hospital room. She contacted a medical malpractice attorney named Gregory Vaughn, 31 years specializing in surgical errors, who agreed to review my case. She reached out to the hospital's patient advocacy office, filed formal complaints, demanded full investigation. She called my oncologist, Dr. Raymond Fletcher, 19 years in cancer treatment, who reviewed my files and confirmed in writing that the tumor had always been in my left tibia, never in my right leg. There was no medical ambiguity about which leg needed to be removed. Dr. Fletcher was disturbed by what had happened, said he'd never encountered a situation where a patient confused which limb had cancer, especially not a patient who'd been dealing with the diagnosis for 8 months and had undergone extensive testing. He offered to testify if necessary. Gregory Vaughn came to the hospital on day 4 post-surgery. He was in his 60s, gray hair, sharp eyes, moved with the confidence of someone who'd seen every excuse hospitals make for malpractice. He reviewed the consent forms, the documentation Dr. Brennan had provided, and the medical records showing the tumor location. Then he asked me to walk him through everything I remembered about the morning of surgery. I told him about arriving at the hospital, checking in, being taken to the pre-op area. I remembered the nurse starting my IV, remembered receiving medication that made me relaxed and slightly drowsy, but not unconscious. I remembered Amanda being there, holding my hand. I remembered Dr. Brennan coming in to verify the surgical site one more time, asking me which leg had the tumor, me confirming it was the left leg. I remembered him marking the X on my left shin with the surgical marker. I remembered Amanda kissing me goodbye and being wheeled toward the operating room. Then nothing until the recovery room. Vaughn asked if I had any memory, even a vague or dreamlike one, of asking to change the surgical site. I told him no. Absolutely nothing. He asked if I'd been confused about which leg had the tumor at any point in the 8 months since diagnosis. I said never. Not once. The pain had been in my left leg consistently. Every scan, every test, every appointment had focused on my left leg. There was no possibility I'd suddenly believed the cancer was in my right leg. Vaughn nodded slowly, making notes. He said the case came down to my word against Dr. Brennan and Patricia Donnelly's testimony, complicated by the fact that I'd apparently signed a form requesting the change. But he found several things suspicious. First, hospitals had multiple redundancy protocols specifically to prevent wrong site surgery. The X marking on my left leg should have been verified by multiple staff members before I entered the operating room. The fact that it had been removed and replaced without additional verification raised questions. Second, the timing was odd. Amanda had been present for the surgical site confirmation, had seen the X marked on my left leg, then had been asked to leave the prep area. Immediately after her departure, I'd supposedly become confused and demanded a different leg be amputated. That sequence suggested either genuine medication-induced confusion or something more troubling. Vaughn requested surveillance footage from the pre-op area. Hospitals typically maintained cameras in certain sections for security and liability purposes. If footage existed showing the conversation where I'd allegedly requested the surgical change, it would clarify exactly what had been said and my mental state at the time. The hospital's legal team, led by an attorney named Douglas Finch, 18 years defending medical institutions, denied the request. They claimed no cameras covered the specific prep bay where I'd been, that privacy concerns prevented recording in pre-operative areas. Vaughn filed a motion to compel discovery of any existing footage and to preserve all relevant evidence. He also requested the original consent forms I'd signed weeks before surgery, the ones specifying left leg amputation, to compare signatures and establish my actual intentions. Meanwhile, I was scheduled for the second amputation. The cancer in my left leg was still growing, still threatening my life. Every day the surgery was delayed gave the tumor more time to spread. But I couldn't bring myself to trust Dr. Brennan or Riverside Medical Center anymore. Amanda found a different surgeon at a different hospital. Dr. Alicia Huang, 23 years in orthopedic oncology at Providence Medical, reviewed my case and agreed to perform the left leg amputation. She was horrified by what had happened at Riverside, said wrong site surgery was supposed to be impossible with modern protocols. She explained her facility's verification process, showed me the checklists they used, the multiple sign-offs required before any amputation. I felt slightly reassured, but mostly numb. The surgery was scheduled for 10 days after my discharge from Riverside, 10 days to adjust to having one leg gone and prepare to lose the other. The physical and emotional toll was devastating. I couldn't walk, could barely manage the wheelchair. Phantom pain from my right leg was constant, sharp, and burning despite the limb being gone. The pain in my left leg, the real pain from the tumor, had gotten worse. I spent those 10 days in our bedroom, watching my life fall apart while Amanda tried to hold everything together. She'd taken leave from her job as a graphic designer, was managing my medical care, dealing with insurance companies, coordinating with Vaughn, and trying to support our kids who were terrified and confused. Austin had stopped talking much, just came home from school and disappeared into his room. Lily cried every time she looked at me. I felt like I was watching my family suffer because I'd somehow failed to protect myself from an amputation I never requested. The second surgery happened on a Monday morning. Dr. Huang and her team were meticulous, professional, compassionate. They verified the surgical site multiple times, showed me the X they marked on my left leg, had Amanda confirm she witnessed it, documented everything with photographs and written checklists. When I woke up from anesthesia this time, both legs were gone. I was a bilateral below-knee amputee. The tumor had been removed, the cancer was gone, but I'd lost twice as much as I should have. Dr. Huang came to check on me in recovery, said the surgery had gone perfectly, that the tumor margins were clean and pathology would confirm complete removal. She asked how I was doing emotionally. I told her the truth. I was destroyed. Not just physically, but psychologically. The amputation I'd prepared for had become something exponentially worse because a hospital claimed I'd changed my mind about which leg to remove. Vaughn called while I was still in the hospital, recovering from the second surgery. He'd gotten preliminary results from his investigation. Riverside Medical Center had produced the surveillance footage he'd requested, but only after his motion to compel had been granted by a judge. The footage showed the pre-op area, showed Amanda leaving after the surgical site verification, showed Dr. Brennan returning to my bay approximately 15 minutes later. But the audio quality was poor, and while you could see Dr. Brennan and me having a conversation, you couldn't clearly hear what was being said. You could see me nodding, see Dr. Brennan gesturing, see Patricia Donnelly standing nearby with paperwork. You could see me signing something, but you couldn't definitively hear me requesting a surgical site change. The hospital claimed this footage proved their account. I'd been conscious, communicative, and had signed the change form willingly. Vaughn said the footage actually raised more questions than it answered. Why had Amanda been asked to leave? Why had Dr. Brennan waited 15 minutes after the initial verification to have this supposed conversation about changing the surgical site? Why wasn't there clearer audio documentation of such a critical medical decision? Vaughn also discovered something else. Dr. Brennan had been sued twice before for surgical errors. Both cases had been settled confidentially, which was why they hadn't appeared in standard background checks. But Vaughn had connections, knew how to dig deeper. One case involved operating on the wrong spinal level during a fusion surgery. Another involved removing the wrong kidney. Both times, Dr. Brennan's defense had been similar to what he was claiming now. The patients had supposedly requested or confirmed the incorrect surgical site while under the influence of preoperative medication. Both times, the patients had no memory of making such requests. Both cases had been settled for significant amounts with non-disclosure agreements that protected Dr. Brennan's reputation. Vaughn believed this was a pattern. Dr. Brennan made surgical errors, then claimed the patients had given confused instructions to avoid malpractice liability. He'd gotten away with it twice before, by settling quickly and silencing the victims. I felt sick reading the details of the previous cases. Other people had suffered similar betrayals, had their bodies permanently altered by surgical mistakes, then been told they'd caused their own injuries through medication-induced confusion. And the system had protected the surgeon rather than the victims because hospitals didn't want to admit their doctors made catastrophic errors. Vaughn said we needed more evidence to prove a pattern of deliberate deception rather than isolated incidents of patient confusion. He reached out to the previous victims despite their NDAs, hoping they'd be willing to speak confidentially to establish the pattern. One refused, too traumatized to revisit the experience. The other, a woman named Diana Phelps, agreed to talk. Diana had been a 49-year-old accountant when Dr. Brennan removed her healthy kidney instead of the one with a tumor. She'd been told she'd changed her mind about which kidney to remove while under sedation, despite 8 weeks of testing clearly identifying the left kidney as the problem. She'd been shown consent forms with her signature authorizing the change. She had no memory of any such conversation. Like me, she'd lost the healthy organ and had to undergo a second surgery to remove the actual diseased kidney. The hospital had offered her a settlement of $380,000 to sign an NDA and waive her right to pursue further legal action. She'd been desperate, in debt from medical bills, and had accepted. But the experience had destroyed her career, her health, and her faith in medical institutions. She told Vaughn she'd been afraid to speak out because of the NDA, but after learning another victim was going through the same thing, she was willing to testify regardless of legal consequences. She said someone needed to stop Dr. Brennan before he destroyed more lives. Armed with Diana's testimony and the pattern of previous incidents, Vaughn escalated the case. He filed a formal lawsuit against Dr. Brennan, Patricia Donnelly, and Riverside Medical Center for gross negligence, fraud, and conspiracy to commit medical malpractice. The lawsuit alleged that Dr. Brennan had a pattern of committing surgical errors and then fabricating patient consent to avoid liability, that the hospital knew about his history and had failed to properly supervise him or implement safeguards to prevent wrong-site surgeries, that Patricia Donnelly had participated in the deception by providing false testimony about my alleged request to change surgical sites. The lawsuit sought compensatory damages for my medical expenses, lost wages, pain and suffering, and punitive damages to deter future misconduct. It also sought an injunction preventing Dr. Brennan from performing surgeries until a full investigation was conducted. The hospital's response was aggressive. Their attorneys filed motions to dismiss, claiming the lawsuit was without merit and that I was trying to avoid responsibility for my own confused statements. They positioned me as a difficult patient trying to blame medical staff for complications resulting from my own error. Dr. Brennan gave a statement to the local medical board defending his actions, claiming he'd followed proper protocol, and that the lawsuit was a malicious attempt to damage his reputation. Patricia Donnelly stood by her testimony. The message was clear. They were going to fight this hard, protect their institutional reputation, and try to paint me as either confused or lying. But the case started attracting attention. A local investigative journalist named Kevin Ortega, 12 years covering medical industry corruption, reached out after seeing the lawsuit filing. He'd been tracking patterns of wrong-site surgeries across the state and was interested in Dr. Brennan's history. I agreed to an interview, telling my story publicly for the first time. Kevin also interviewed Diana Phelps, who decided the NDA wasn't worth protecting a dangerous surgeon. The article ran as a front-page feature in the Oregonian under the headline, "Surgeon Accused of Pattern of Wrong-Site Surgeries, Blaming Sedated Patients." The piece detailed both my case and Diana's, highlighted the previous settlements, and included commentary from medical ethicists condemning the practice of accepting surgical site changes from patients under heavy sedation. The story went viral locally, picked up by medical news outlets nationally, and suddenly, Dr. Brennan and Riverside Medical Center were facing public scrutiny they couldn't control through legal motions. More victims came forward. A man who'd had the wrong section of colon removed during cancer surgery. A woman who'd received an unnecessary partial mastectomy. Both had been treated by Dr. Brennan. Both had been told they'd given confused instructions preoperatively. Both had settled quietly. 4 victims total, all with the same pattern. Catastrophic surgical errors followed by claims of patient-directed changes made while sedated. The medical board launched a formal investigation. The state attorney general's office announced they were reviewing whether criminal charges were appropriate. Suddenly, the narrative wasn't about one confused patient anymore. It was about a surgeon who'd been committing malpractice for years and using patient sedation as cover. The turning point came from an unexpected source. A surgical nurse named Leslie Thornton, who'd worked with Dr. Brennan for 6 years before leaving Riverside Medical Center, contacted Vaughn with information. She'd been present during my surgery, though she hadn't been in the pre-op area when I'd supposedly requested the change. But she had been in the operating room when my right leg was amputated, and she said things hadn't added up. The X marking on my right leg had looked fresh, hastily drawn, not like the careful surgical markers typically used. The entire surgical team had seemed tense, uncomfortable, like they knew something was wrong but weren't willing to speak up. Leslie had questioned Dr. Brennan during the procedure, asked him to confirm one more time that he was amputating the correct leg. He'd snapped at her, said he'd verified everything with the patient, and didn't need a nurse second-guessing him. After the surgery, when the error became apparent, Leslie had been told by hospital administration to keep quiet, that the situation was being handled, that speaking about it could constitute a HIPAA violation. She'd been uncomfortable with the cover-up but had been afraid of losing her job. Leslie's testimony changed everything. She provided internal hospital emails showing that administrators had known immediately after my surgery that something was wrong, that there were concerns about whether proper protocols had been followed. The emails showed discussions about how to frame the incident to minimize liability, suggestions to emphasize my signed consent form, changing the surgical site, recommendations to present it as patient confusion rather than medical error. The correspondence proved the hospital knew their defense was questionable but had chosen to protect Dr. Brennan rather than admit fault. Leslie also revealed that Dr. Brennan had a reputation among nursing staff for being careless with pre-operative protocols, for rushing through verifications, for becoming defensive when questioned. Multiple nurses had filed informal complaints about his practices, but nothing had been done because he generated significant revenue for the hospital through his high-volume surgical practice. With Leslie's testimony and the internal emails, the case became indefensible for the hospital. Their attorneys approached Vaughn about settlement negotiations. But I wasn't interested in a quick, quiet payout that would let Dr. Brennan continue practicing. I wanted accountability, wanted his medical license revoked, wanted the hospital's practices exposed and reformed, wanted every patient who'd been harmed by this pattern to see justice. Vaughn said that was possible, but it meant taking the case to trial, enduring public testimony, reliving the trauma repeatedly. It meant months or years of legal battles with no guarantee of the outcome I wanted. I told him I understood the risks. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about preventing Dr. Brennan from doing this to someone else. The medical board moved first. Based on the investigation findings and the testimony from multiple victims, they suspended Dr. Brennan's medical license pending a full disciplinary hearing. He was prohibited from performing any surgeries or treating patients until the hearing concluded. For the first time since my surgery, I felt like maybe the system could work. Maybe accountability was possible. The suspension made national news. Patient safety organizations praised the board's action. Medical professionals debated on forums and in journals whether the case represented a systemic failure of surgical protocols or an isolated bad actor. The criminal investigation moved slower, but more definitively. The State Attorney General's office, led by Prosecutor Benjamin Cross, 29 years in criminal law, determined that Dr. Brennan's pattern of behavior constituted fraud and assault. The theory was that he'd knowingly performed surgeries on wrong sites, then falsified patient consent documentation to avoid criminal liability for the assaults. The fabricated consent forms and false testimony from Patricia Donnelly constituted fraud. If prosecutors could prove Dr. Brennan had deliberately created the appearance of patient-directed changes to cover his own errors, he could face felony charges. The case was presented to a grand jury, which indicted Dr. Brennan on 4 counts of assault and 8 counts of fraud, 1 for each victim and each fabricated consent form. The trial was scheduled for 11 months after my initial surgery. By then, I'd learned to use prosthetics for both legs, had returned to teaching part-time, and was slowly rebuilding my physical capabilities. But the psychological damage remained profound. I had nightmares about the surgery, panic attacks when I needed medical care, a deep distrust of doctors and hospitals that made even routine appointments agonizing. Amanda and I were in couples therapy trying to process the trauma and its impact on our marriage. The kids were in counseling too, working through their fear and anger. We'd been shattered by what happened, and healing was slow and incomplete. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Prosecutors presented testimony from all 4 victims, showing the pattern of wrong-site surgeries and fabricated consent. They presented the internal hospital emails proving administrators knew there were problems, but chose cover-up over accountability. They presented expert testimony from surgical safety specialists who explained how many protocols Dr. Brennan had violated, how implausible it was that 4 different patients had all given confused instructions that happened to result in wrong-site surgeries. Leslie Thornton testified about the operating room atmosphere during my surgery, about Dr. Brennan's defensive reaction when questioned, about the hospital's pressure to stay silent. Diana Phelps testified despite the emotional cost, describing her experience and the settlement that had bought her silence. Kevin Ortega's investigative reporting was entered as evidence, showing the public interest implications of the case. Dr. Brennan's defense was that he'd acted in good faith based on what patients told him, that the similarity between cases was coincidence, not pattern, that he was being persecuted by victims who didn't want to accept responsibility for their own medication-induced confusion. Patricia Donnelly maintained her testimony that I'd clearly requested the surgical site change, though under cross-examination, she couldn't explain why she hadn't documented the conversation more thoroughly or why Amanda hadn't been brought back into the room for such a critical decision. The defense's position required the jury to believe that 4 separate patients had all coincidentally become confused about which body part needed surgery while sedated, despite months of clear diagnosis, and that Dr. Brennan had simply been unlucky to encounter multiple such cases. The jury deliberated for 2 days, found Dr. Brennan guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in prison, acknowledging that while the crimes didn't involve traditional violence, they'd caused profound harm to victims who'd trusted him with their bodies and their lives. Dr. Brennan's medical license was permanently revoked. Patricia Donnelly was charged as an accessory to fraud, accepted a plea deal, lost her nursing license, received probation and community service. Riverside Medical Center faced separate civil penalties from the state health department, was required to implement comprehensive reforms to their surgical protocols, and paid a 7-figure fine. The hospital also settled the civil lawsuit for an undisclosed amount that Vaughn said was one of the largest medical malpractice settlements in Oregon history. The money helped, paid for ongoing medical care, prosthetics, physical therapy, mental health treatment for me and my family, provided financial security so I could reduce my teaching hours while adjusting to disability. But it didn't give me back my right leg. Didn't erase the trauma or the betrayal. Didn't change the fact that I'd trusted a medical system that had failed me catastrophically and then tried to gaslight me into believing I'd caused my own injury. The settlement included provisions requiring Riverside Medical Center to implement new protocols for surgical site verification, mandatory audio recording of all preoperative consent conversations, and independent patient advocates present during pre-op processes for any patient receiving sedation. Changes that should have existed already, that might have prevented my injury and the injuries to the 3 victims before me. 2 years after the surgery, I attended a patient safety conference where I was invited to speak about my experience. The audience was filled with medical professionals, hospital administrators, and patient advocates. I stood at the podium on 2 prosthetic legs and told my story. Told them about trusting Dr. Brennan, about waking up with the wrong leg gone, about being told I'd changed my mind while sedated. Told them about the pattern of victims, about the hospital's cover-up, about the criminal trial and conviction. And I told them why I was speaking. Because every surgical patient is vulnerable. Because sedation removes our ability to protect ourselves. Because we have to trust that medical professionals will put our well-being above their convenience, their pride, their liability concerns. When that trust is betrayed, when institutions choose to protect themselves rather than patients, people die or suffer permanent harm. I said Dr. Brennan's conviction and the hospital reforms weren't enough. That every medical institution needed to examine their protocols, their culture, their willingness to believe patients over providers when something goes wrong. The speech was recorded, shared online, used in medical school ethics courses. I received messages from other victims of medical errors, people who'd been harmed and then blamed, whose injuries had been minimized or explained away. The solidarity helped, knowing I wasn't alone in experiencing institutional betrayal. But it also reinforced how common these failures were, how many people suffered silently because they couldn't afford legal battles or didn't have the evidence to prove what happened to them. Amanda and I rebuilt our lives slowly. I returned to full-time teaching, adapted my coaching style to work from a wheelchair during practices, learned to embrace my disability, rather than view it as only loss. The kids adjusted as kids do, became protective and proud of how I'd fought back against the system that had harmed me. Austin wrote a paper for his ethics class about medical accountability using my case as the central example. Lily joined a youth advocacy group focused on patient rights. Our family had been marked by trauma, but also by the choice to demand justice and use our experience to protect others. 3 years after the initial surgery, I received a letter from a medical student who'd studied my case in her ethics course. She thanked me for speaking out, said my story had changed how she thought about patient vulnerability and medical power dynamics. She promised to remember my experience throughout her career, to always verify surgical sites multiple times, to believe patients who said something was wrong. That letter made me cry, not from sadness but from hope that maybe some good had come from the worst experience of my life, that maybe my suffering had meaning if it prevented future victims. I still have nightmares sometimes, still experience phantom pain in my right leg, the one that should still be attached to my body, still struggle with medical anxiety and the knowledge that institutions will protect themselves before they protect vulnerable individuals. But I also know I fought back, refused to accept the gaslighting, found allies and evidence, held the surgeon and hospital accountable, made changes that would protect future patients. That has to count for something, has to matter, because the alternative, accepting institutional betrayal as inevitable and individual patients as powerless, is too devastating to contemplate. Dr. Brennan is in prison serving his sentence. His conviction sent shockwaves through the medical community, forcing conversations about surgical error protocols and accountability that had been avoided for too long. Patricia Donnelly works in retail now. Her nursing career ended by her choice to lie to protect a doctor rather than stand up for patients. Riverside Medical Center's reforms became models for other institutions, and I'm here, living with the permanent consequences of medical malpractice, but also living as proof that fighting back against institutional power is possible, that victims can become advocates, that justice, while imperfect and incomplete, is worth pursuing. The surgeon said I changed my mind before the operation. The hospital backed his lie. But the truth came out anyway. Not easily, not quickly, but eventually and definitively. That's what I want anyone facing similar betrayal to know. Document everything, find allies, refuse to accept gaslighting, trust your own memory and experience even when institutions tell you you're wrong, and fight. Not because victory is guaranteed, but because silence guarantees nothing changes. I fought and lost my right leg, but I won accountability, justice, and reforms that might save someone else from the same fate. In the end, that has to be enough. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.